Welcome all. So, in this week's Parashat, there's a unique mitzvah that raises a very interesting thought experiment. I think is worth discussing for a minute. In the pasuk it says as follows. It says in the beginning of Parashat Vayakhel, the pasuk says, "L'svaru eish b'chol v'seichem." The Torah reiterates the Isser of Havara on Shabbos. Now, Chazal in several places in the Gemara bring a machlekes if Havara is l'lav yatza, to tell you that Havara is a lav, or Havara is l'chalak yatza, to tell you that if one does multiple of the lamites malachas at the same time, he's chayiv independently for each one of them. Now, additionally, aside from that algemein machlekes that's all over about what the tachlis of this reiteration of Hilchos Shabbos is in this week's parsha, the Chinuch brings, and this is brought in the Rambam as well, and other Meinei mitzvahs, the unique mitzvah that we learn out of this pasuk, and that's as follows. The Chinuch says the mitzvah that we learn from this pasuk is Shalayasu hadayanim dinim b'Shabbos. Dayanim should not dan any dinim on Shabbos. K'leimer shemishin is chayiv misa b'bezdin. Someone who became obligated to be punished by death, to get capital punishment b'bezdin, lo yemisu b'Shabbos. They shouldn't put him to death on Shabbos. Shenemar le'sivaru eish b'chol mishvisechem b'yom Shabbos. And this teaches us Ubaha Pira Shalab Bezesh Yisrufu Bezdin b'Shabbos Mishin is chayiv streifa. This is to teach us that Bezdin should not be Seirif, somebody on Shabbos who's obligated to get Sreifa. Now this, before we explain what this is and what this is about, this comes from the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Lamed Testament, bit Lamed Eim and Beis, the Gemara brings as follows. The Gemara brings a tzad that as follows. We should make a kal v'chemer. Since we know that the pasuk says Mi'im Mizbechi Tekechenu Lamos, that a person who's chayiv to be killed, you take him even from the Mizbeach B'Shas Avoda. So says the Gemara, perhaps we should make a kal v'chemer. Ma avoda, that's Deicha Shabbos. So Ritzicha, when Bezdin has to put somebody to death, which is Deicha avoda, kal v'chemer, it should be Deicha Shabbos. So meaning someone who's obligated to be put to death by Bezdin should be taken off on Shabbos and killed. Then the Gemara brings another man to Amr. The Gemara says, no, Amr Rava Kvar Paska Tana Dvei Rishmol. This trial is already resolved by the Tana Dvei Rishmol. Why? The Tana Dvei Rishmol, Le'sivaro Eish, Mat HaMalemar. The pasuk says, it reiterates Le'sivaro Eish, Mat HaMalemar. What do we learn from that? So for the Gemara jumps in right away, it says, Mat HaMalemar, Ilar Rav Yaisi, L'Lav Yatsi, Rav Nasan L'Chalak. So we know it's a pre-existing machlekes. And the Gemara references that machlekes. The Gemara says, no, Afal Pikein, there's something else to be learned over here. And that is that you're not ma'anish somebody on Shabbos. Somebody deserves to be put to death. You don't put him on Shabbos. You don't put him to death on Shabbos. Now, the Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin, in Perek Dalet Halach Vav, the Yerushalmi also brings this in a slightly more, complete fashion. The Yerushalmi says, Rav Lo b'shem Rav Yanai, mikan lebatei dinim shlo danim b'Shabbos. This teaches us that batei dinim should not be done b'Shabbos. My taima, nemer kan b'chol moish v'seichem, v'nemer lahalan v'hayu elu lechem l'chukais mishpat l'dereseichem b'chol moish v'seichem, ma lahalan mi bezdin akasav medavar, afkam bezdin akasav medavar. The Gemara brings a drasha that bezdin is not supposed to be done dinim on Shabbos. That's the Yerushalmi and the Bavli and Azay's Gepaskim. Now, when the Chinuch comes to explain this, the Chinuch explains this in a very interesting way. Says the Chinuch, Mishrasha mitzvah. The understanding of this mitzvah, he says, is as follows. Ratza Hashem Yisparach, L'chabed hayom hazeh. Hashem wanted to be L'chabed this day of Shabbos, Shiyimtzu by Menucha HaKol. Everybody should be able to find some Menucha on this day. Gam HaChaytim v'HaChayavim, even those who are sinners and are obligated to be punished. Mashal Melech Gadol Shekara B'nei Medina Yom Echad L'Suda. A mashal for a king who gathered together all the members of his Medina. The king does not withhold entry, doesn't bar entry to anybody. Then after the Suda is complete, then the king will revert back to the regular dinim and he'll do the mishpat. And included in that is to allow even sinners and even people who are obligated to be punished to be included in that celebration of Shabbos. Now, putting aside the actual tenets of this mitzvah as it is, which is an interesting and unique mitzvah that's brought down in the Chinuch over here, there's a really element over here that's a fascinating element, meaning seemingly there's some sort of maila to the king or even to the nation of the king, that the fact that they have the participation of all, including the sinners. Meaning, a person could think that having people who are every Aveira who are not living by the code, their participation brings nothing to the table. And there's no reason to include them. what this mitzvah, the way the Chinuch explains it is showing a certain element that Klal Yisrael as a whole, or even HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kaviyachol, benefits from having every segment of Klal Yisrael participate in the Shabbos. Now, there's an interesting mirror Gemara to this, and that's as follows. The Gemara in Tainis, on the Vav Mebeis, the Gemara says as follows. Amar Rav Chana bar Bizna, Amar Rav Shimon Chasida. Kol Tainis she'ein ba miposhei Yisrael, any communal fast that doesn't have within it the participation of the sinners of Klal Yisrael, einay Tainis, is not a fast that's going to have any impact. Why sharei chelbana reichei ra, the chelbana, which is one of the spices that were included in the Keteris, is reichei ra, umana hakasav and simanei Keteris, and still the Torah delineates it together with all the rest of the simanei Keteris. Rashi, Rashi al Chumash in Parashat Shema, in the Parashat of Keteris, Rashi brings the same thing. Rashi says, "L'lamdenu, to teach us, shalei kabel beinenu letzaref yimanu ba'agudas tenu yisenu." We should not withhold these people from being incorporated and included in our fast days. It's important, the Adarab, that the Poshei Yisrael should be included with us when we do these public fasts. So the Gemara over here seemingly seems to be saying a similar concept, that somehow Klal Yisrael seems to benefit from having the whole picture, which includes even Poshei Yisrael, when even the sinners of Yisrael, of Klal Yisrael, are included in it. Now, in the Drashas Haran, in Drush Aleph, the Ran says something very along these veins. The Ran explains, and he says, "Zulasa kikein ha'inyan b'tzaref imanu b'avedeseinu l'Hashem Yisbarach." He says it's a beneficial inyan when they join with us in the avodah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ha'chaytim v'ha'poishim shlei yafsidu avedeseinu. That somehow by their not participating, they diminish our avodah, and by their participation, they enhance our avodah. When they join us and they participate in the avodah that we're doing, it enhances the avodah of Klal Yisrael as a whole. And he follows through it. He says, and when we have the full inclusion of every segment, including the sinners, so, and he riffing off the mashal of the Keteris, he says perhaps having these foul-smelling Jews and foul-smelling spices being added to the mix, by some way it enhances and brings to life the full flavor of the other flavors. Now, Kilu, seemingly what's being expressed over here is that separating in a very complete sense from sinners and people who are not following the Torah properly is seemingly not dafka positive, meaning at the time that you want to make it a tefillah or a tainis or a Shabbos, which is celebrating our bond with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we seemingly are desirous of having the inclusion of all different segments of the population, and amongst them, even sinners. Now, this concept of when do we say, when do we say split off completely and don't have anything to do with sinners, or when do we say that we benefit as a whole by having sinners, has been over the Deiris an extremely controversial piece. Now, just before we say some historical occurrences and where it sells the chayes, incidentally, Afanart and Tainus, the Marsha and Felicia Argadis, the Marsha reads a nuance in that it says the Chalbana was nimna together with the other meaning of Keteris. The Chalbana wasn't like a participant; it's listed together with them. Mano hakasav and Simone Keteris. It says so. To which the Marsha explains that the tziruf of Poshei Yisrael Tadavar Shekdusha, this that we like to include, sinners of Klal Yisrael into Tadavar Shekdusha with the rest of Klal Yisrael, is only when there's first a full minyan, a full quorum, a full body of actual Jews who are following and adhering to the Torah. Only then are we able to be somewhat inclusive and bring in some of these outside elements to participate in the Tefillah Klal Yisrael. So the Marsha and others after him, the Mabit, not after him, the Mabit in Beis Elikim, and the Chida's grandfather Chesed Lavram, and the Chidah himself elsewhere, all seem to temper the message of this Gemara and say that that's all provided that the Yerei V'Shleimim have a full quorum, they have a minyan, they have something set up on their own. But to include Poshei Yisrael when they're not, fully set on their own, that's something would be much more difficult to do. Now, incidentally, it's kedai to be aware that the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Nun Hey, when it handles the sugi of an actual minyan for tefillah, Shulchan Aruch says that Poshei Yisrael could be included in the minyan, and there it's talking about where there's not a minyan preceding the Poshei Yisrael's inclusion, and exactly who's considered a Poshei Yisrael and what the exact ramifications of this halach is b'zman hazeh, I'll leave for now. But is a sugi farzich, who's a tin shnishba, who's an avarian, who's lahachis, there's a lot of reading the Pesach in Siman Nun Hey. Now, you say this to a question of when Kilo Klal Yisrael benefits from being inclusionary and having all different stripes as part of our Eda. And when Klal Yisrael says Hibadlu, we separate and we move on, is a very controversial and pertinent detail that rose up many, many times throughout Klal Yisrael's history. For example, I think this is the first time that this was mamish institutionalized and it was set up. The separatist was by the Tailong in Hungary. Now, just by way of a little background story, so the Hungarian nation was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire under Franz Josef, King Franz Josef, the emperor or the king of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, headquartered in Vienna, and the Hungarians always felt like a bit like second-class citizens. And during the 1840s, there was a big separatist movement, like of Hungarians trying to raise up to fight against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and kind of a civil war to secede and get, Hungarian identity. They fought for the fatherland. And during the late 1840s, many from and not from Jews joined very much together with the Hungarian separatist movement to try to join that movement. Now, in 1849, ultimately, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is victorious, and it stamps out the rebellion of the Hungarian nationalist, movement. And what happens is that tremendous war taxes and punishments are imposed on the different segments of Hungarian society that participated in this revolt, in this uprising against the Austro-Hungarian king. Now, the Jewish community was taxed extensively, leading to like a big immigration. Tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews emigrated during that period to get away from it because they didn't want to be stuck with these taxes. But ultimately, the Jewish Kehillah renegotiated with Emperor Franz Josef, and they agreed that they would not have to pay a war tax over a long duration of years, and instead, he allowed them to pay 1 million, whatever the currency of the day was, 1 million Reichsmarks, or whatever the currency of the day was, to settle this chayv, and that million was going to go into a fund that was going to pay for Jewish schools in all the different towns. Now, the problem was that these Jewish schools were more often than not ran by the Neolog community, by the Reform community in Hungary, and they were ending up to the point that they were producing graduates who were barely religious, who had all different sensibilities. So ultimately, the Orthodox Kehillah in Hungary felt very marginalized by this school system that was making it very difficult to raise from children in Hungary. And this was like a constant battle through the 1850s and 60s between these two different Kehillahs. Now, ultimately, every few years, the emperor would order a meeting of representatives of the full Jewish Kehillah from, the length and breadth of Hungarian Jewry, and they would get together to discuss, the nature of their arrangement with the emperor and all those details. Now, in 1869, the emperor was ready to give the Jews some sort of emancipation. He was ready to let the Jews have some sort of freedom to practice, their own religion. Now, he summoned hundreds of representatives from all different towns throughout Hungary, but the minister in charge of this get-together made it by popular vote, so that out of the 280-something representatives of Hungarian Jewry that went down to Vienna to meet the emperor and to have this meeting, only 88 of them were what we would call Charedim, were from Kehillahs, and the rest of them were Neologs, were people who were, part of the Reform and conservative movement in Hungary, and were trying to transition Judaism to where they saw the next step. Now, when this meeting was taking place, the Hungarian Rabbanim, including amongst them the Ksav Sefer, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, many other big names, a lot of the Talmidim of the Ksav Sefer, I think Rav Hillel of Kalamaya was there. And even though there was some internal division between these different branches of Hungarian Orthodoxy as to how canonistic to be, or how moderate to be, what to include, where they could concede, where they can't concede, overall, these 88 Rabbanim decided that they needed to make a Tailung, and they petitioned the government for a Tailung, which means to be able to separate off, to form their own community. And the basic premise of their argument is that if we remain within the larger umbrella organization of Jews in Hungary, we're going to lose our firm identity. We're going to be Jews by name only, not with a firm identity. As opposed to if we make a Tailung and we separate ourselves off and we make a from Haredish community, we'll be able to continue and have Haredish communities. Now, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch published a letter we have from that time. I think he called it a Sefer Galoi, a letter explaining the rationale for the Tailung. Others at the same time published it as well. And basically the premise of what they're saying is as follows. The main theme is Jews are only Jews with the Torah. and when they have the Torah and when they keep the Torah. There's Rav Sadi Goyen and Moritz Videus. Rav Sadi Goyen says the same thing. The only thing that makes Jews Jews is the fact that we share a Torah, that we keep the Torah. And what these Rabbanim felt at that time was that remaining under the larger umbrella of Jews in Hungary would strip away the Torah from the identity of Jews, and therefore they felt like it was time for a Tailung. Similarly, Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, I think only a few years later in Frankfurt, when he had the opportunity to break off from the community, he broke off harshly and left with no remnant of connection to the community that he was part of, advancing the same rationale. And again, it's in writing. I think you can see Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's rationale in the Shelas Shuvas Shemesh Marpeh. I think there's a few of them there, a few different ones. He writes, very harshly that there is no. He says, Yagia l'rik. One could work, totally tirelessly for nothing. To find a makar for this idea, he says, we never saw, he says, you never find that an Ir Nidachas, a city that's being, and that is being going to be punished and burnt to the ground with everything inside of it, including the mezuzahs, you never find that we say, since it has some tzaddikim in it, now it's considered a city of tzaddikim. He says, you're not going to find anywhere that there's a way to join forces and to operate under one umbrella with people who are not, bound by religion at all. He says, Ki yesh chayva aleinu l'srachik betachlis harikuch, mishiteseyim moistes hapikarsis v'amina shalem godlo. He says, we have an absolute and complete chiyuv to separate ourselves and to not be part of those institutions that they are produced from and producing in. He says, Ein davar kazeh k'may minus v'hapikarsis michutz liyadus u'betoich liyadus. He says there's no such a thing as like internal mias, Jews who are part of our community but are still minim, and external mias, minos. He says you don't have to become a different religion to not be part of this religion. He says as long as you're not bound by the Torah's laws, you're not part of it. So this is something that the Hungarian Rabbanim during that meeting in 1869 and Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch in the 1870s shortly after followed with is this idea of a tailung, this idea of separating ourselves, because we say although there is some benefit in remaining bound up with all Jews, even Jews who are not as strictly adhering to the Torah, that's only provided that, like we're seeing from the Marsha and from others, that the quorum is formed by frum Jews. That ultimately there's a basis of frum Jews who have a kehillah, and then they have the ability to include amongst them some other more peripheral, Jews who are struggling, and we all benefit, so to speak, from that. That's like the chalbana, sherei chara, but still it's included. But when the umbrella organization is no longer bound by the identity of being a Torah organization, then the ability to blend and to mesh with other streams, i.e. the Chalbana of Klal Yisrael, that's not allowed anymore. Now, one of the most controversial places, and I'm not really going to get into this now, that this arose, was in the early 1900s. Rav Kook wrote several letters, published several letters, and this is a shmuz for a different time. Rav Kook published several letters where he seems to be presenting this idea that Klal Yisrael as a whole benefits from having, all parts of Klal Yisrael be part of it, and even if those Jews, and he's referring to secular Zionists at the time, are not, pursuing a Torah lifestyle, still Klal Yisrael as a whole, he says, benefits from having everybody being part of it. And he wrote Michtav Galei to the Rabbani Yerushalayim in defense of Ben Yehuda, who had spoken negatively about Haredi Jews. And the Kehillah in Yerushalayim put out a Michtav Galei, back, against or towards him. And a lot of the arguments being presented back and forth over there between both of these sides hinge on this discussion of when do we say inviting, people who are not holding, but we're holding into the tent is the Bechin of Chalbana. It's including, someone who's a little more meruchik in some sort of thing, and everybody benefits from that. Similarly to what the Chinuch is saying over here with Shabbos, that Shabbos is like a big tent that includes even every Avera. And when do we say that we're not able to form a quorum on our own, and if we bring them in, we diminish ourselves, and we have to say Hibaldim B'Teichayida? I leave this as an open kind of thought experiment. I think that obviously this is something that's very subject to every dar in exactly what the lay of the land is, and therefore it's something that needs to be left up to the Einei Eidah, the Gedei Adar, to decide when the time is to be inclusive and when the time is to be separatist. But it's an interesting thought experiment that arises from this unique mitzvah in this week's Parsha. Thank you.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.